Concerns to NATO and the United States about the gradual but relentless movement of NATO's eastern border to the border with Russia were ignored. All these pleas for a halt, requests for discussions, and appeals to re-examine arrangements on the European continent for national security, potentially even including Russia as part of the larger regional security structure, were frankly disregarded. Simultaneously, there were people lying directly to President Putin. We know this now from both former German Chancellor Angela Merkel and President Macron. The Mince process, meant to address Moscow's concerns for the welfare and rights of Russians inside Ukraine, was merely a ploy to delay any solution and pacify Russia. It also aimed to buy time for the fledgling Ukrainian state that emerged after the 2014 Maidan coup, or radical nationalist state, to build itself up into a regional military power. These issues are the primary reasons for the frustration on the Russian side and the decision ultimately reached in January to use military power, primarily to signal Russia's concerns. I think another aspect deserving attention is that Mr. Putin is a victim of what we call rational choice theory. This theory has been popular for years, assuming that people are rational and pursue their individual interests. This notion applies to economics and political life, but in reality, people frequently act against their interests, driven by emotions rather than reason. When Mr. Putin initially deployed a relatively small force of just over 200,000 men, intending to send around 990,000 initially along a broad front, his aim was to signal the seriousness of Moscow's concerns about Ukraine potentially joining the NATO alliance and becoming a base for a potential attack against Russia. He believed, without much consideration, that historical caution would prevail. Since the Second World War, there had been an understanding in both Moscow and Washington to avoid escalations leading to a nuclear exchange, given Russia's status as a nuclear power. He misjudged the West. He should have paid attention to the proposals submitted in December and January, which were not seriously considered. Essentially, Moscow was told, Ukraine joins NATO, or there's no other option, which was unacceptable. Consequently, he sent a small force into Ukraine with instructions to minimize losses, avoiding attacking Ukrainian forces in their bases. His intention wasn't to spark a full-blown war but to signal Moscow's seriousness while minimizing collateral damage. However, this strategy failed miserably. When talks between Ukrainians and Moscow began, interventions from outside powers made it clear that they didn't desire a settlement. Boris Johnson's visit, at the behest of President Biden, explicitly discouraged Ukraine from accepting neutrality or any compromise and promised support to prevail over the Russians. Mr. Putin's assumptions about past behaviors of the West couldn't inform him about the present. Many who previously had milder views towards Russia now express hostility due to Russia's national identity, language, culture, and Orthodox Christianity. These aspects clash with the globalist ideologies governing the United States and much of Western Europe. These globalist governments have opened borders, admitting millions who don't share European heritage, leading to a clash of cultures and identity. Mr. Putin is in an impossible position. Short of drastic measures like resigning from office and allowing Western allies to strip Russia of its resources and govern it, there seems to be no feasible way out. He finds himself reluctantly engaged in a war he never truly wanted and has exercised significant restraint even up to this point. I don't believe he or his generals ever anticipated that the Ukrainians would act so recklessly and launch continuous counterattacks against their defenses in the south, which have now been annexed because of its Russian population and historical ties. Yet, it has occurred, and Ukraine is now utterly defeated. Its losses are staggering, with hospitals overwhelmed. We estimate that the Ukrainians have lost somewhere between 300,000 and 350,000 soldiers killed just in the last month. The Ukrainian casualties number around 30,000 killed, which are absurdly high figures, akin to the scale of killing seen in World War I. In contrast, Contrary to popular belief, the Russians have sustained very light losses, perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 killed in action and a similar number wounded, most of whom were able to return to duty, unlike many severely wounded Ukrainians. However, none of this seems to matter to people in Washington, Brussels, and perhaps even in Oslo, Stockholm, Copenhagen, Berlin, or Paris. There's a prevailing exercise in self-delusion perpetuated by the media, asserting that the Russians are losing and the Ukrainians are winning. This delusion emboldens other countries like Poland, Lithuania, and those with their own agendas, divorced from NATO, to align themselves at Ukraine's expense. It's crucial to consider the wider conflict because Russia perceives NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat. This is significant because if we defeat the Russians, it could potentially escalate to a nuclear war. On the other hand, if we assume we cannot defeat them, why did we pursue this course of action? Even Bill Clinton in January 1994 argued that NATO expansion might divide the continent, with his Secretary of Defense William Perry considering it so perilous that he contemplated resignation in opposition. Shockingly, his colleagues in the Clinton administration agreed that NATO expansionism might provoke conflict with Russia, but they dismissed it since they perceived Russia as weak. The prevailing narrative is at odds with the truth. If the truth is suppressed, people are more likely to believe the false narrative. However, perceptions seem to be shifting. In Germany, Austria, Hungary, and even Poland, public opinion is turning against direct military intervention in Ukraine. Likewise, in France, Italy, Spain, and the United States, people seem wary of using military force against Russia. The issue lies with the elites who persist in their original flawed assumptions. They believed Russia was weak and economically vulnerable, which has turned out to be untrue. Politically in the United States, those advocating for a war against the Russian state and people are essentially waging a similar war against their own people by attempting to reshape Russia's national identity, borders, and culture. Similar sentiments are arising in Europe, where populations in countries like France and Germany are becoming increasingly disillusioned with their government's actions, perceiving them as eroding Western Christian culture and civilization, a heritage they value and wish to preserve. In essence, there's nothing inherently wrong with embracing Western Christian culture and civilization that has evolved over the last 2,000 years. Yet, the elites seem intent on homogenizing and diluting these values, aiming for a mass without distinct identities or values. This echoes the failed Soviet attempt to create a Soviet man devoid of any identity or individuality, an agenda that didn't succeed then and seems equally misguided now in the Western context.